So our next speaker is Professor Mark Cutkosky, and I think he's a Fletcher Jones Chair in the School of Engineering at Stanford University. I think he doesn't need much introduction. I think we all read some of his papers. He also mentored so many distinguished researchers in our community. Professor, the stage is yours. Thank you.
All right, well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you, and it's great to be able to talk to such a design-oriented group. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Do you all see my title slide? Great. I thought that today, since the title of this talk was about mechanisms from design, from inception to realization, that I would really talk today more about design process. And I should start by saying that the thing that actually brought me to Stanford originally is a very strong design group that has been there since, going all the way back to the 1960s. Combining creativity with design. And over many years, I've been involved in co-teaching a course which is called ME310, a third one down, which has roots going back to, I think around 1970. In fact, some of the first graduates of that course included Vic Scheinman, who was the designer of the Puma robot, Larry Leifer, Warren Searing at MIT, and others. And so over the years, many other design courses have grown alongside. And what I find is that there are elements of these design courses that we do use in developing new robots. And so I co-teach this course, graduate design sequence. We take projects that are general project areas suggested by companies. Classically, it should be what we call needs pull. That is to say, we see a need for something. Like, for example, we want a wall climbing robot. And that was what Darka said. But to tell the truth, a lot of the time it's also technology push. Like, we have this technology, what's it good for? For example, we have some gecko-inspired adhesives. What are they good for besides climbing walls? And this is a course in which I've met many good designers, including Songbei Kim, who I see is in the audience, also Elliot Hawks, Hao Zhang, Hannah Stewart at Berkeley, and many others. And what we find when we talk to alumni of that course is that there are some elements of the design process that we teach that sort of stick with them. So we start pretty much every new project by doing what we call need finding and benchmarking. And benchmarking is really going out there and looking what other kinds of technology might be available, what has been done that you could adapt. So if you wanted to do a wall climbing robot, you see, well, yeah, you could, there are magnetic devices and so on. There are also things that use a vortex to suck themselves to the wall. But each of these has limitations, like they only work on certain surfaces, for example. So then you say, okay, well, what about biology? We could go to biology for some benchmarking. And indeed, there are many interesting techniques out there in the world of nature. Geckos, insects in particular, have some capabilities that look useful on a range of surfaces. Then, having done some benchmarking, we asked the teams, okay, look, it's time to do a first very early design cycle. And this usually incites panic. How can you possibly ask us to be prototyping something? We don't know what we're designing yet. And the answer is, well, yeah, you have to start somewhere. Yeah, but we don't know what the requirements are yet. Yes, even so, you have to start somewhere, put a stake in the ground, and do a very early prototype, because you will learn something from that. And I love this Dilbert cartoon, which pretty much captures how I think they feel. And if it wasn't obvious, that's the design team, and this is the instructional staff. All right, so let's prototype something. So what we asked them to do, and actually I'm co-teaching the course right now, and the teams are right now being asked to do what we call a critical function prototype. Now, what I find is that when people talk about prototypes, usually they think of it as a proof of concept. It's something that you show to somebody else to tell them what you have in mind. That is not what we mean. What we mean is to create a very early physical subsystem that answers a question for you yourself as the designer. For example, if you think the design might possibly go in a certain direction, what prototype could you make that would give you some insight about whether that idea is going to work? Really build something. Answer a non-obvious question that you couldn't have just answered by reading the literature or doing an analysis. It's not a proof of concept. It is at most a proof of an inkling of an idea. So, for example, if I'm thinking that insect spines might be a way to climb a wall, what kind of critical function prototype could I use? And as I'm looking at that, I realize that, you know, when you think about claws and spines in nature, there are these sort of scaling things that are apparent. So, you know, they range from insects to bears, but the bear solution with claws doesn't really work on surfaces like brick or concrete. On the other hand, the insect, very small spines do work both on wood surfaces, on slightly rough plastic surfaces, and so on. So that's a more appealing direction to go in. And so if you think about it, then the question you have is, okay, well, what is the appropriate spine scaling for a robot? What surfaces will it be able to climb? Now we're starting to hone in on what I would call a critical function prototype. And we found there was a nice article by Stanislav Gorb and his colleagues that showed that if you have an insect spine and you can sort of model it by saying, look, let's take the tip radius of this spine, and if I compare that to the radius of a typical bump on the surface, as long as the spine tip radius is smaller than the average bump radius, I will be able to exert respectable forces. So that works. But then the question is, well, insects are very small. How do we scale this to something that weighs a kilogram or maybe multiple kilograms? Well, that means we're going to have to share the load among multiple spines because each spine can't carry very much force. So we did not just one, but lots of critical function prototypes, which you see building across the screen here. And by the way, it's only the ones in the bottom row that were really starting to work. All the top 3 rows were things that failed. So this is what I mean by a critical function prototype. This is not a robot. This is just testing a specific idea for load sharing among spines. And oh, by the way, what if none of them worked? I mean, we had a DARPA contract. DARPA wants results. And by golly, we had to have a robot that would climb. So this is something which I think almost nobody has seen. A lot of people have seen videos of StickyBot, but almost nobody has seen the super glue foot. We had 2 students working over the summer. You inject super glue and accelerant into this little wire frame in the middle. It bonds almost instantly. And then to release it, you run a bunch of current through the nichrome wire and it vaporizes the glue and it pops off. So that was our backup plan, although obviously not our preferred one. Once you've done critical function prototypes and you're starting to move a little along the design, you have to do a system level prototype. This is something that our ME310 students will be needing to do in winter quarter. And we have 2 stages of that. We have functional with a K, funky, and we have a more regular. The F with a K version, the idea is to put something together very rough so that you don't commit too much to materials and form, but it starts to have some of a system flavor. And when I try to explain this concept to the students, this example I love to use is from Top Gear when they were challenged to build an electric car, and it is the quintessence, I think, of functional with a K. Again, here's a picture which I think hardly anybody has seen. Way before SpinyBot, this was our functional prototype. And you can see it's got hot melt glue, straws, wires, springs, bits of duct tape. And, but darn it, it worked. To my knowledge, it was the first robot that could climb outdoor building surfaces. Didn't have a tether. Certainly the first using spines. And we gave it the somewhat politically incorrect name of Tony Tetherless because at that time the head of DARPA was a guy named Tony Tether. And we learned from that, and that's what led us to the slightly more refined functional prototype for SpinyBot, something more conspicuously insect-inspired. And a lot of work on analysis, testing spine mechanisms. We started to learn about the ratios of normal and tangential stiffness that we need to have something that would attach to surfaces and drag along. Also, a lot of work on how spines interact with surfaces. I won't go into details, but you get a traced surface and it's only these sort of heavy green areas. That's where the spine has the potential to latch and sustain a load. And it's also statistical. In fact, we're still, doing refinements on statistical modeling of how spines grip surfaces. So for example, if you've got a surface like this concrete in the upper right corner, as the spine radius, tip radius increases, your probability of finding a little bump, an asperity within a certain area drops off according to this statistical function. So that culminated in SpinyBot. I think this is a video which more people have seen. We start out with Bob Fole's cockroaches on a rough surface, arguing for the advantages of spines, and then compare it with our robot. Although you'll notice if you look that the cockroach is being slowed down by nearly a factor of 10 in order to look something like our robot climbing walls. And there we are on the outside of Macy's at the Stanford shopping center. We early on learned that you don't ask for permission. You just go and wait until somebody complains. And showing the spine mechanisms. Okay, well, one of the things we needed to minimize the number of actuators, so a lot of interesting work on under-actuated mechanisms so that we got a kind of a desired stroke with just one actuator. Again, this stuff with the equations is in a paper, but what many fewer people have seen is the very early prototyping using Legos. Now you see we're back to that critical function prototype idea. And by the way, that's one of the things that we tell students is that the critical function prototype stage does not end. You just wind up using it on different things as you go. And this gets refined. This is a slide from Song-Bei's thesis, building some theory around what we started to observe. And ultimately culminating in the RISE robot, which was a collaboration with UPenn Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, Boston Dynamics built most of the robot, and Keller Autumn at Lewis and Clark. It was as close, I think, as DARPA actually got to the spider robots in the movie Runaway. And we're almost out of time, so I'll show just a moment of this, the RISE robot at Sword. And there you see our spine mechanisms that we had been working on the feet of the RISE robot, enabling it to climb. Okay, I'm going to move on. All right, so when we write our papers on these robots, we do it like this. You have a concept, you present your design model and some analysis. It informs the design, you do some tests, and you get some results. But what I hope I have made clear from this very short talk is that the real design process is not like that. It's like this. You have a concept. If you're a good designer like Song-Bei or Elliot or Hannah Stewart or many of the other people gone through the lab, you actually have a pretty good intuition about something that will work. You build an early prototype, indeed it does work, and that leads to your design. And then, okay, if we're going to write the paper, we need to have a model to explain to others why it actually works. But lo and behold, when you do the model, you actually learn more and you refine your design. You realize you could get better performance, and so the design goes through an iteration, and finally you test it and get your results. And then, yeah, then you write the paper, and when you write the paper, it goes like this. All right, so let me wrap up. It is a messy process, but it's also a lot of fun. And with that, let me stop and take questions.
Sure, thank you for this very cool talk. I think we only typically see the other side of this talk, just is beautiful papers and impressive results. And thank you for showing this really challenging design process. If there's any question from the audience? I think I saw one question from the Q&A box. Once, like Louis asked about, do you see some technology barriers? For example, some robots we are not able to design, right? In terms of technology feasibility, for some robots that you are working on.
Sure. I mean, I think sensing has come a long way. Actuation remains an issue, as Ron Fearing mentioned. You know, it's getting better, and yet, you know, if you look at today at the kind of sensors that were available, you know, 30, 40 years ago compared to what's available today, there's been enormous improvement. If you look at the kind of motors that were available 30, 40 years ago compared to what's available today, there is some improvement, but not as much.
Right.
For good reasons, like second law of thermodynamics. So that's one area. Ron mentioned a little bit about artificial actuators, and they're very promising, but they need to mature more too.
Yeah. I think somebody kind of started some really interesting area doing some motor technology. I think, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done to make motors and actuators, including sensors, to really can match human performance. Yeah. I think due to the time limit. Mate, do you want to speak?
Sure. I was just wondering. I was inspired by the 3 rows of non-functional spiny feet before getting to the functional ones, and I was just worried. You know, how do you keep the from losing faith during that time, especially when it's something so small? It's hard to get an intuition, a gradient.
Right.
How fast does it have to be?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was the better part of a summer. And the thing is that we knew that there had to be a way, because after all, spines were working for insects. The part that wasn't out there was, well, yeah, but insects don't weigh anything. How do we really load share? There has to be a way to do that. But, you know, the thing about a DARPA project is that it's not like NSF. They want to see results by the end of year 1, or you don't get any funding in year 2. So that was why we had the backup plan with the super glue foot. I mean, when it was time to do our show, if the spines weren't ready yet, that we were going to use that.
Yeah, I think it's a tough decision to make sometimes, and we always need to run to some deadline and make an important go or non-go decision somewhere. Yeah.
And as for in-house manufacturing, well, honestly, it's kind of like what you see on that slide that I'm still showing. I mean, yeah, it's rapid prototyping and casting, and as Ron Fearing mentioned, oh my gosh, adhesives and primers that stick well and don't delaminate, and lasers and all those things, and kind of messy. I remember when Elliot Hawks finished, and then he took a postdoc with Alison Okamura down the hall, and I warned her that the Elliot corner of the lab was going to be far messier than she was anything used to.
Yeah, that happened to many design-oriented robotic labs. Yeah, thank you for your really inspiring talk, and really appreciate your insight to this our community. Yeah.